The sleet did not fall so much as it attacked. It drove down in sharp, freezing sheets, cutting through the thin wool of Elara's gray dress like broken glass. She stumbled against the trunk of a massive pine, her breath tearing out of her lungs in ragged white plumes. Her left hand gripped the rough bark to keep her upright. Her right hand remained pressed fiercely against her chest, guarding the folded piece of paper hidden beneath her bodice. It was just a ledger page, a single sheet of heavy parchment, stained with ink and damp with her sweat. But to Elara, it was the only proof that she was a human being, not a line item to be traded in the muddy auction yard of Garland Cross's Mercantile. Her boots, unsuited for a mountain pass in the dead of winter, slipped on the frozen rock. She went down hard on one knee. Pain flared through her joint, sharp and blinding, but she bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. She refused to cry. She had not cried when the town stood by in silence as Garland publicly declared her father's fabricated debts. She had not cried when they bound her wrists to humiliate her into submission. She would not cry now, alone in the dark, with the wind howling like a starved animal. She forced herself to stand. The left shoulder of her dress had torn on a low-hanging branch miles ago, exposing her pale skin to the biting wind. The cold had long since moved past a physical sensation. It was a heavy, dull ache settling deep into her bones. If she stopped moving, she would die here. Garland's hired trackers would find her frozen corpse by morning, pry the ledger page from her stiff fingers, and the truth would vanish under the snow. Through the blue, shifting veil of the storm, a sound broke the rhythm of the wind. Thwack. It was a heavy, dull sound, wood splitting. Elara squinted against the sleet. High up on the ridge, tucked beneath a protective overhang of black stone, a faint orange glow pulsed against the darkness. It wasn't a town. It wasn't a sheriff's outpost. It was a single, isolated structure. She pushed forward, using the trees for leverage. The climb was brutal, the incline steep and slick with ice. Her fingers were completely numb, her body operating purely on the primal instinct to survive. As she crested the ridge, the shape of the building materialized. It wasn't. It was a standard log cabin. It was a stone and timber fortress, squat and wide, with a massive stone chimney pouring thick gray smoke into the storm. Heavy wooden double doors, reinforced with iron straps, stood shut against the weather. Outside, in a small clearing shielded by the rock face, a man was splitting wood in the dark. He moved with a mechanical, relentless rhythm. He wore a heavy canvas coat, the collar turned up against the wind, and thick leather gloves. He didn't seem to notice the freezing sleet. He raised an axe, his broad shoulders shifting under the heavy fabric, and brought it down. The log split perfectly in two. Elara took a step out of the tree line. Her frozen boots snapped a dead branch buried under the snow. The man stopped. He didn't flinch. He didn't spin around in a panic. He simply lowered the axe, his body going completely still. Slowly, he turned his head. From the shadows of the tree line, Elara must have looked like a ghost. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, her gray dress soaked and clinging to her shivering frame, the torn shoulder exposing bruised, frost-bitten skin. She stood there, trembling violently, her arms wrapped around herself. The man stared at her. His face was weathered, sun-baked bronze lined by years of harsh living. A thick, salt and pepper beard obscured his jaw, but his eyes, deep-set and dark brown, were piercing. They took in her tour and dress, her lack of a coat, and the desperate, guarded way she held her hand against her chest. For 10 agonizing seconds, neither of them moved. The wind screamed through the pines. Elara's vision began to blur at the edges. She tried to speak, to ask for shelter, but her jaw was locked tight from the cold. The man didn't ask her name. He didn't ask who was chasing her, or what she had done to end up on a frozen mountain pass in the middle of the night. He looked at her boots, then at the bruised skin on her shoulder. He turned away from her and walked toward the heavy wooden doors of the forge. He lifted a massive iron latch and pushed one of the doors open. Immediately, the golden, roaring light of a massive iron stove spilled out onto the snow. The heat hit the freezing air, creating a cloud of warm steam. It was the most beautiful thing Elara had ever seen. The man stepped inside, leaving the door wide open. He didn't invite her in. He didn't offer a welcoming smile. He simply provided the opening, trusting her to have the strength to cross the threshold herself. Elara moved. Her legs felt like lead, but the promise of the heat pulled her forward. She stumbled across the clearing, her boots dragging in the snow. As she reached the doorway, her knee buckled again. Before she could hit the ground, a heavy, leather-gloved hand caught her arm. The grip was firm, impossibly strong, but carefully restrained. He didn't pull her against him. He merely held her steady, taking her weight until she found her footing. She looked up at him. Close up, he smelled of wood smoke, hot iron, and pine sap. "Inside," he said. His voice was a low, flat rumble, entirely devoid of pity. It was a practical command. Elara stepped past him into the forge. The warmth was absolute. It wrapped around her, shocking her frozen nerves so violently that her entire body seized in a massive, uncontrollable shudder. The space was large, the walls lined with heavy tools, anvils, and stacks of cured wood. In the center, a massive cast-iron stove radiated a fierce, glowing heat. The man followed her in and pushed the heavy wooden door shut. The sound of the iron latch falling into place was a heavy, definitive thud. It cut off the howl of the wind instantly, leaving only the deep, rhythmic crackle of the fire. He walked past her, ignoring her shivering form, and went to a small wooden table. He picked up a tin cup, dipped it into a bucket of water, and set it on the edge of the table near the stove. Then, he dragged a sturdy wooden chair closer to the heat source. He didn't look at her. He pointed a leather-clad finger at the chair. "Sit. Drink slowly. Not too fast, or your stomach will reject it." Elara practically collapsed into the chair. She reached for the tin cup with shaking hands. The water was room temperature, but to her raw throat, it felt like a miracle. She took a small sip, her teeth chattering so hard they clinked against the tin. The man took off his heavy canvas coat and hung it on an iron hook near the door. Underneath, he wore a faded thermal shirt that stretched across his broad back. He picked up a rusted iron stove hook, opened the grate of the massive heater, and expertly shifted the glowing embers, adding 2 more logs to the fire. He was deliberately giving her space. He kept his back to her, allowing her the dignity of recovering her breath without being stared at. Elara watched him. Every man she had encountered in the past 48 hours had looked at her with either predatory greed, mocking amusement, or cowardly indifference. This man did not look at her at all. He focused entirely on the fire. She slowly lowered her right hand from her chest. The ledger page was still there, safe beneath the damp wool of her bodice. She took a deeper breath, the warm air expanding painfully in her lungs. "Thank you," she managed to say. Her voice was raspy, broken. The man closed the iron grate. He turned to face her, leaning the iron hook against the stone base of the stove. He looked at the torn shoulder of her dress, then at the mud caked on her skirt. "I am Silas," he said, his tone offering no pleasantries. "You are running from something." It wasn't a question, it was an observation, stated as plainly as a fact about the weather. Elara lifted her chin. She was exhausted, terrified, and halfway to freezing to death, but her dignity remained fiercely intact. "I am Elara, and yes, I am." Silas held her gaze for a long moment. He didn't pry. He didn't demand to know the details of her trouble. He simply gave a slow, single nod. "The pass is frozen over," Silas said quietly. "Whoever is behind you won't make it up the ridge tonight in the dark, but they will find the tracks by morning." He turned away, walking toward a small cot tucked into the far corner of the room. He pulled a thick, woven wool blanket from the mattress and brought it over to her. He didn't drape it over her shoulders. He set it on the table beside the tin cup. "Wrap up," he said. "Get warm." He walked back to his cot, sat down, and pulled off his boots. He laid down on the bare mattress, turning his back entirely to the room, to the door, and to her. Elara stared at his broad back in disbelief. He had just taken in a fugitive, handed her his only blanket, and turned his back on a stranger. But as her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light away from the stove, she noticed something. The rusted iron stove hook he had used to tend the fire was leaning against the stone base, exactly an arm's reach from where she sat. And beneath Silas's cot, positioned near his right hand, was the heavy handle of a hunting knife. He wasn't careless. He was, giving her a weapon to feel safe, while keeping his own hidden. For the first time since the auction yard, Elara let out a long, shaky exhale. She reached for the wool blanket, wrapping it tightly over her torn dress. As the fire crackled, holding the brutal winter at bay, she closed her eyes, knowing that for tonight, at least, she was no longer property. But outside, beneath the howling wind, she knew Garland's trackers were already waiting for the dawn. The silence inside the forge was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of a prison. It was the thick, insulated silence of a true sanctuary. Outside, the sleet continued to lash against the timber and stone, a relentless percussion that only emphasized the absolute security of the four walls enclosing her. Elara sat perfectly still in the wooden chair, the heavy wool blanket pulled tight around her trembling shoulders. The brutal, stinging pain of thawing flesh began to creep into her fingers and toes. It was an excruciating sensation, the blood forcing its way back into half-frozen capillaries, but she welcomed it. Pain meant she was alive. Pain meant she had survived the climb. She kept her gaze fixed on the glowing belly of the cast-iron stove. She did not want to look at the man on the cot, terrified that if she acknowledged him too much, the fragile illusion of her safety might shatter. In her 28 years, Elara had learned that men rarely offered anything without expecting a corresponding payment. For the last 3 days, her entire existence had been reduced to a ledger entry. When her father's heart finally gave out, Garland Cross had not even waited for the earth to settle over the pine coffin before presenting the debt. It was a staggering, impossible number. A fabricated sum built on forged signatures and phantom supply orders. But Garland owned the mercantile, the bank, and the sheriff. In a frontier town built on hard currency and brutal pragmatism, the law was whatever Garland Cross wrote on a piece of paper. Elara looked down at her boots. They were ruined, the cheap leather peeling away from the soles, caked in a thick layer of frozen gray mud. It was the same mud from the auction yard behind the mercantile. The memory flashed behind her eyes, unbidden and sharp. Standing in the freezing muck, her wrists bound not with iron, but with a piece of rough hemp rope, a theatrical choice by Garland to ensure the humiliation was complete. The townspeople had gathered, people she had sewn dresses for, people whose children she had offered sweets to. They had looked at her not as Elara Hayes, the seamstress with the quiet smile, but as property, a lot to be bid on, a debt to be settled by forced marriage to one of Garland's unwashed, violent enforcers. She remembered the laughter, the awful, casual way the men had discussed her worth, eyeing her frame as if calculating how many years of labor they could extract from her before she broke. Elara's jaw tightened. She instinctively reached a hand under the wool blanket, pressing her fingers against her bodice. The stiff edge of the ledger page was still there. She had not just run. When Garland's men had gotten drunk celebrating their new acquisition, leaving her locked in the mercantile's back office, she had found the master book. She had found the original entries, the crossed-out numbers, the undeniable proof of Garland's systematic fraud that had robbed half the valley of their land. She had torn the page out, broken the window latch, and fled into the storm. She was a thief now, a hunted woman. But as she sat in the glowing warmth of the forge, feeling the solid iron stove hook resting just inches from her knee, she felt a strange, fierce pride. She had refused to be delivered. A floorboard creaked. Elara flinched, her hand darting toward the iron hook. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the fight-or-flight instinct instantly overriding her exhaustion. But Silas had not risen to approach her. He had merely shifted his weight on the narrow cot, rolling onto his side. His broad back remained firmly turned to the room. His breathing was deep, slow, and rhythmic. He was giving her the room. Elara let her hand fall away from the iron hook. She watched him for a long time. The man was a giant, built with the dense, heavy muscle of someone who had spent a lifetime striking an anvil. He could have taken the ledger. He could have demanded answers. He could have... I've tied her to the chair and waited for the bounty hunters to arrive to collect a reward. Instead, he had given her his blanket, stoked the fire, and gone to sleep, leaving a weapon within her reach. It was a profound, unspoken statement of respect. It was the exact opposite of the auction yard. The heat of the stove worked its way through her damp dress, drying the wool and soothing the deep, aching chill in her bones. The exhaustion she had been holding back with sheer adrenaline finally breached her defenses. Her eyelids grew impossibly heavy. She tried to stay awake, calculating the distance to the door, listening for the sound of dogs over the wind, but the steady, rhythmic crackle of the fire was a lullaby she could no longer resist. Elara leaned her head against the high back of the wooden chair, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes. When she woke, the quality of the light in the room had changed. The roaring orange blaze of the stove had settled into a deep, pulsing bed of cherry-red embers. The wind outside had lost its screaming edge, replaced by a low, hollow moan that suggested the sleet had turned to heavy snow. The cabin was still comfortably warm, but it was the quiet, deliberate sound of someone working that had pulled her from sleep. Elara did not move immediately. She kept her breathing slow, her eyes opening just a fraction to observe the room through the veil of her lashes. It was a survival instinct, honed over the last 72 hours. Never reveal you are awake until you know what the room looks like. Silas was not on his cot. He was sitting at a heavy oak workbench on the far side of the forge, illuminated by a single low-burning oil lantern. He was awake, fully dressed in his thermal shirt and heavy trousers, his suspenders casting long shadows against the stone wall. He was working on something. Elara opened her eyes a little wider. He had her boots. He must have slipped them off her feet while she was in her deepest sleep, moving with an impossible quietness for a man of his size. One boot was clamped securely in a wooden vise. Silas held a heavy awl in one hand and a thick, waxed thread in the other. He was meticulously driving the needle through the tough, peeling leather of the sole, pulling the thread taut with a sharp, practiced motion. He was fixing her boots. Elara watched him, a strange, tight knot forming in her throat. There was nothing romantic or gentle about his movements. They were the precise, heavy-handed motions of a craftsman doing necessary work. But the sheer practicality of it, the understanding that she would need solid footwear to survive whatever came next, and his willingness to repair them without waking her to ask for permission or gratitude, was the most profoundly caring thing anyone had done for her since her father died, she said, shifted slightly in the chair. The wool blanket slipped a few inches, exposing the torn left shoulder of her dress. As she moved, a sudden, cold panic spiked through her chest. Her hand flew to her bodice. The fabric was flat. The ledger page was gone. Elara sat up sharply, the blanket pooling at her waist. Her hazel eyes darted around the immediate space around the chair, scanning the rough-hewn wooden floorboards. She found it. The heavy parchment had slipped from beneath her dress while she slept. likely dislodged when she shifted or when Silas had carefully removed her boots. It lay on the floorboards, halfway between her chair and Silas's workbench. It was face up. The light from the oil lantern fell directly across the corrupted ink, illuminating the list of names, the fabricated interest rates, and the unmistakable, heavy signature of Garland Cross at the bottom. Silas had stopped working. The awl was still in his hand, but his hands were resting on the workbench. His head was turned slightly. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the floor. He had seen it. The silence in the forge stretched, suddenly taut and fragile, like a wire pulled too tight. Elara's breath hitched. Her hand instinctively reached toward the rusted iron stove hook leaning against the stone base. She didn't want to use it. She didn't want to fight this man who had just mended her boots. But if he knew Garland Cross, if he knew the bounty that was surely on her head for stealing that ledger, the sanctuary of the forge could become a cage in a heartbeat. "I know that signature," Silas said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. He didn't raise his head. He just kept staring at the paper on the floor. Elara's fingers brushed the cold iron of the hook. She gripped it, her knuckles turning white, but she didn't lift it. "Then you know what kind of man wrote it." "I know," Silas replied slowly. "That Garland Cross does not send men into a winter pass at night for a runaway bride. He sends them for what she took." Silas set the awl down on the workbench. He turned his head and finally looked at her. His deep-set brown eyes dropped to her hand, taking note of her white-knuckled grip on the iron hook. He didn't look angry. He didn't look threatened. He just looked tired, carrying the heavy exhaustion of a man who realized that the war he had walked away from 10 years ago had just found its way to his doorstep. "You stole his master ledger," Silas stated. "I took back what he stole from my father," Elara corrected, her voice trembling but her chin raised in defiance. "And from half the valley. That paper is the only proof." Silas stood up from the workbench. He was massive, his broad shoulders blocking the light of the lantern. Elara tensed, her grip tightening on the iron hook, her eyes calculating the distance between them. Silas didn't move toward her. He walked to the center of the room, bent down, and picked up the ledger page with his thick, calloused fingers. He didn't read it again. He simply folded it carefully in half, then in half again. He took 2 steps toward her. Elara braced herself. Silas stopped right at the edge of the blanket. He held the folded parchment out to her. "Put it back," he said quietly. "Keep it hidden." Elara stared at the paper, then up at his weathered face, entirely thrown by his reaction. You're not going to make me leave?" Silas looked toward the heavy wooden doors of the forge. The wind had died down, replaced by a heavy, ominous stillness. "The sleet has stopped," Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of any illusion. "The sky is clearing, which means the moon will light the pass, and the fresh snow won't cover your tracks fast enough." He turned his dark eyes back to her. "They aren't waiting for morning anymore. They'll be here before dawn." Elara's hand trembled as she reached out and took the folded ledger page from Silas's massive, calloused palm. Their fingers did not brush, but she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. She pulled the heavy parchment back against her chest, slipping it safely beneath the damp wool of her bodice, right over her heart. She stared at the man standing before her. He had seen the proof of her crime, recognized the signature of the most dangerous man in the territory, and his first instinct had not been to turn her in, but to warn her that time was running out. "You knew my boots were ruined," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackle of the iron stove. "You knew I wouldn't be able to run again." Silas didn't answer immediately. He turned away from her, his broad back shifting beneath the faded thermal shirt, and walked back to the heavy oak workbench. He picked up her boots. The peeling leather soles had been expertly stitched back together with thick waxed thread, the seams tight and durable. He walked back to her chair and set them on the floorboards right at her feet. "Put them on," he said, his voice flat. "The fire warmed the leather. It'll help the circulation in your toes." Elara pulled the heavy wool blanket tighter around her torn shoulder and slid her feet into the boots. The warmth inside the leather was immediate and profound, a stark contrast to the agonizing ice that had gripped her extremities for the last 3 days. She laced them up, feeling a sudden, sharp wave of gratitude that threatened to bring the tears she had sworn to hold back. She swallowed hard, forcing the emotion down into the tight knot in her chest. She looked at the stove, the orange embers reflecting in her hazel eyes. The heat brought the scent of the ledger page up to her nose, old paper, dried ink, and the faint, sour smell of spilled whiskey. The scent pulled her violently backward, a visceral memory hooking into her ribs. The back office of the Mercantile, just hours ago. The muffled sound of drunken laughter echoing from the main storefront as Garland Cross and his men celebrated their successful auction. Elara, locked in the freezing storage room, her wrists raw and bleeding from the hemp rope she had finally managed to saw through against a rusted nail. She had crept into the office looking for a weapon, but instead she found the master book left open on Garland's desk. The whiskey glass beside it had left a wet ring over her father's name. She had seen the numbers. The original debt for lumber and seed was $60. The number written over it in heavy black ink was 400, and beneath it, the forged signature of a man whose heart had been failing for months. The realization had not brought fear. It had brought a cold, absolute rage. She had torn the page loose, the sound of the ripping paper impossibly loud in the small room, and climbed out the high transom window into the blinding sleet. "He didn't just forge my father's debt," Elara said aloud, the words breaking the heavy silence of the forge. She looked up at Silas, her eyes fierce. "He inflated the numbers for a dozen families. When they couldn't pay, he took their land. When my father died, he had nothing left to take but me."
Thank you.
Silas was standing near the heavy double doors, his hand resting on the iron latch. He looked at her, his deep-set brown eyes unreadable in the dim light. "I know," Silas said quietly.
Thank you.
Elara frowned, her brows drawing together. "How could you know? You live on a mountain. You said you recognized his signature, but 10 years ago, Garland Cross wasn't a merchant. He was a deputy for a corrupt county judge," Silas interrupted, his voice low and completely devoid of emotion. He turned his gaze away from her, looking at the heavy iron straps reinforcing the wooden doors. "They started arresting miners who couldn't pay the new territorial taxes. They didn't have enough jail cells, so Cross came up here, to my forge." Silas walked over to a dark corner of the room, near the stacks of cured wood. He reached down and grabbed hold of something heavy. "He brought a wagon load of raw iron," Silas continued, the strain evident in his thick arms as he "Eat it all. If we have to move, you'll need the energy." Elara didn't argue. She forced herself to chew the tough meat, her stomach nodding in protest before the desperately needed nourishment took hold. She kept the wool blanket tight around her shoulders, the torn fabric of her dress hidden beneath it. As she ate, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. The relentless percussion of the sleet against the roof had stopped. The howling wind, which had been a constant, terrifying companion since she escaped the Mercantile, had simply vanished. In its place was a silence so profound it felt heavy, pressing against her eardrums. Silas noticed it too. He stopped moving. He stood perfectly still in the center of the forge, his head tilted slightly toward the reinforced doors. He closed his eyes, listening to the absolute absence of sound. "The storm broke," Silas murmured. He walked to the far wall, where a small, narrow window slat was cut into the stone, covered by a heavy wooden shutter. He unlatched the shutter and pushed it open just an inch. A single, brilliant shaft of silver light sliced through the darkness of the forge, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The moon is out, Silas said, turning away from the slat. His jaw was locked tight. The sky is clear. The temperature is going to drop 20 degrees before dawn. Elara stopped chewing. And my tracks? Frozen solid into the mud and ice, Silas confirmed. A blind man could follow them straight up the ridge. The reality of the situation settled over Elara like a lead weight. She looked at her repaired boots, then at the iron bar sealing the door. Silas had given her shelter, warmth, and the first moment of dignity she had experienced in days. But she had brought a war to his doorstep. Silas did not look panicked. He walked over to his cot, reached underneath the mattress, and pulled out a long, heavy, lever-action rifle. He didn't cock it. The metallic clack would carry too far in the still night air. But he checked the chamber with a practiced, silent efficiency. He walked over to the table and picked up his heavy canvas coat, shrugging it on over his broad shoulders. He looked at Elara, sitting small but remarkably straight in the wooden chair. "Stay away from the window slat," Silas ordered, his voice dropping to a low, commanding whisper. "Keep the blanket on if the door breaches. You move behind the anvil in the corner and you stay low. Do you understand?" Elara looked at the massive iron anvil, then at Silas. She didn't shrink away. She gave a single, definitive nod. Understood. Silas gave her a final, appraising look, a silent acknowledgement of her courage, before turning his attention entirely to the door. He stood to the side of the entrance, blending into the deep shadows cast by the dying fire, the rifle held loosely but ready in his hands. The silence inside the forge stretched, agonizing and thick. Every breath Elara took felt too loud. She gripped the rusted iron stove hook beside her chair, her knuckles white. Then she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a sharp, distinct sound cutting through the freezing mountain air outside. Crunch. A heavy boot breaking through the crusted top layer of the snow. Then the low, wet snort of a horse, immediately followed by the subtle, metallic jingle of a bridle. They weren't coming before dawn. They were already here. The crunch of boots on the frozen snow stopped just outside the heavy double doors. Inside the forge, the silence was absolute. Elara knelt behind the massive, cold iron of the anvil, her back pressed hard against the stone wall. She gripped the rusted stove hook so tightly her fingers ached, her breathing shallow and soundless. The repaired, leather boots kept her feet firmly planted on the floorboards, ready to spring, but her heart was hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against the ledger page hidden beneath her bodice. Outside, a horse blew hot air from its nostrils, a wet, shuddering sound in the freezing night. Silas Vance. The voice that cut through the thick timber of the door was raw, grating, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was not a voice asking for shelter. It was the voice of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted by force. "We know she's in there," the voice continued. "Her tracks lead straight up the ridge, right to your doorstep. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Blacksmith. Unbar the door." Silas did not answer. He stood entirely swallowed by the deep shadows beside the entrance, his broad shoulders squared, his canvas coat absorbing the faint moonlight that bled through the cracked window slat. He held the lever-action rifle in his right hand, the barrel pointed toward the floorboards. He was a statue carved from the very stone of the mountain, exuding a quiet, lethal patience. "I know you can hear me, Vance," a second voice sneered, slightly higher-pitched and wired with nervous energy. "You've been out of the game a long time. You don't want a war with Garland Cross over a seamstress who can't pay her bills. Send her out and we ride away. Nobody gets hurt." Elara squeezed her eyes shut. The torn fabric on her left shoulder brushed against the rough wool of the blanket. They were reducing her to nothing again, a rue. No way debt. A piece of lost property to be retrieved. "This is private land," Silas's voice boomed suddenly. He didn't shout, but his low, gravelly baritone resonated through the heavy timber doors, vibrating with an immovable authority. "You are trespassing. Turn your horses around and ride back down the pass." A low, cruel laugh drifted through the wood. "Cross owns the law in this valley, Vance. That makes us the law tonight. And the law says we're coming in." The heavy thump of a boot kicking the center of the double doors echoed through the forge. The iron straps groaned, but the massive 6-foot iron bar Silas had dropped into the brackets didn't even vibrate. The door was practically a fortress wall. "Hell, this thing is solid," the second voice muttered outside. "Break the window slat," the first man ordered. "Or climb the roof and drop a powder charge down the chimney. Smoke the bastard out. I don't care if the girl chokes. Cross just wants the paper she stole." Elara's eyes snapped open. Smoke them out. If they dropped black powder down the chimney, the blast would blow the heavy cast-iron stove apart, filling the enclosed space with lethal shrapnel and suffocating smoke. Silas knew it too. He looked toward the high stone chimney, then down at the glowing red embers visible through the stove's grate. In a siege, a fortified room only kept you safe until the enemy realized they could turn it into a coffin. Silas. He could not let them dictate the terms of the fight. He had to draw them into his domain. He looked across the dim room to where Elara crouched behind the anvil. He caught her eye. He didn't offer a reassuring smile, but he gave a sharp, definitive nod. "Stay down." Silas reached out and deliberately, loudly, racked the lever of his rifle. The metallic clack-clack was deafening in the quiet room. Outside, the men instantly stopped moving. "He's armed," the younger man hissed. Silas didn't intend to fire. In the enclosed, dark space of the forge, the muzzle flash of a rifle would blind him and instantly reveal Elara's position behind the anvil. He set the loaded rifle down silently against the stone wall. Instead, he reached out to the tool rack beside the door and closed his heavy leather glove around the long, thick handle of a 5-pound smithing hammer. It was a brutal, ugly tool, forged for shaping raw iron, not for fighting. But in the hands of a man who had spent his life wielding it, it was devastating. Silas moved to the iron bar securing the doors. He looked back at the stove. He needed darkness. Complete, absolute darkness, to rob the bounty hunters of their advantage. He picked up a bucket of loose ash and dirt sitting near the door and, with a swift, smooth motion, hurled it directly into the open grate of the stove. The red embers were instantly smothered. The plunged into a pitch-black abyss, save for the single, brilliant sliver of white moonlight piercing the window slat. Before the men outside could react to the sudden absence of smoke from the chimney, Silas gripped the massive iron bar with both hands. He lifted it silently from its brackets and set it on the floor. He unlatched the heavy door and stepped back, melting completely into the impenetrable shadows behind the doorframe. Outside, the first man pushed against the timber. He expected resistance, but the door swung open smoothly, yielding to his weight. "He unbarred it," the man whispered, his revolver drawn and cocked. "He's giving up." "Watch the corners," the older man warned. They stepped over the threshold, their boots crunching on the frost that had formed on the stone entryway. The blinding white light of the full moon spilled in behind them, casting their long, sharp shadows across the wooden floorboards. They peered into the pitch-black interior, their eyes struggling to adjust from the bright snow outside to the absolute darkness of the forge. "Vance?" the older man called out, tracking his revolver across the empty space, aiming vaguely toward the smothered stove. "Step out where we can see you." Elara held her breath, biting down on her lip until she tasted blood. She could see the silhouettes of the two men clearly against the moonlight, but she could not see Silas. He had vanished into the very architecture of the building. The younger tracker took a step forward, his rifle raised to his shoulder. He passed the open doorframe, walking deeper into the kill zone. "I don't see him. Maybe he slipped out the back." "There is no back door, you idiot," the older man snapped, taking a step inside. Silas moved. He didn't step out. He simply seemed to detach himself from the shadows. The sheer speed of a man his size was terrifying. He didn't make a sound until the heavy steel head of the smithing hammer swung in a brutal horizontal arc. It didn't hit the man's head. Silas was not a murderer by choice, but it slammed directly into the side of the younger tracker's rifle. The impact sounded like a thunderclap. The heavy iron shattered the wooden stock of the Winchester, ripping the weapon from the man's hands with such violent force that the tracker's shoulder dislocated with a wet pop. The man screamed, spinning backward into the snow. The older tracker whipped his revolver toward the sound, his finger tightening on the trigger. Before the hammer of the gun could fall, Silas dropped his smithing tool and lunged. His heavy canvas coat absorbed the moonlight for a fraction of a second as he closed the distance. His left hand clamped over the cylinder of the revolver, jamming the mechanism so it couldn't rotate and fire. With his right hand, Silas gripped the man by the throat and drove him backward. The momentum carried them both out of the doorway and into the freezing night. Silas slammed the tracker hard against the thick exterior stone wall of the forge. The air left the man's lungs in a violent whoosh, his legs kicking uselessly in the snow. Silas twisted the jammed revolver from the man's grip, tossed it into the darkness, and dropped him to the ground. It was over in less than 10 seconds. There had been no chaotic shootout, no stray bullets tearing through the cabin to threaten Elara. Just a terrifying, overwhelming display of physical dominance and tactical precision. Silas stood in the snowy clearing, the harsh mountain wind tearing at his unbuttoned canvas coat, his breath rising in steady white plumes. He didn't look breathless. He looked like a man who had just finished a routine chore. Inside the cabin, Elara slowly rose from behind the anvil. Her knees were shaking so badly she had to lean against the cold iron to stay upright, but she refused to cower. She stepped out of the shadows, the wool blanket clutched tightly around her shoulders, and walked to the doorway. The younger tracker was writhing in the snow, clutching his ruined shoulder and moaning in agony. The older man, slumped against the stone wall, coughed violently, spitting a mouthful of blood and saliva into the white snow. He looked up at Silas, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and furious disbelief. "You're a dead man, Vance," the tracker wheezed, clutching his bruised ribs. He glared past the giant blacksmith, his eyes locking onto Elara standing in the doorway. He saw the torn dress, the defiance in her posture. "You hear me? You're both dead." Silas stepped forward, blocking the tracker's view of Elara entirely. His broad back became an absolute shield. "You ride back to Colder Creek," Silas commanded, his voice cold and flat. "You tell Garland Cross he has no jurisdiction on this mountain. If he sends men up here again, I will not let them walk back down." The older tracker let out a wet, rattling laugh, his chest heaving. He wiped the blood from his chin with a shaking, gloved hand. "You think you won?" the man spat, leaning his head back against the stone. "You think breaking my ribs changes anything? Cross knows what she took. He knows the ledger is missing. That paper is the only thing keeping him from taking the whole damn county." The tracker looked up at Silas, his teeth stained red in the moonlight. "He ain't gonna stop, Blacksmith. He's rallying the deputies right now, every hired gun on his payroll. If we don't ride back with that ledger by sunrise, he's bringing a posse of 30 men to burn this ridge to ash, and he's going to string you both up from the highest pine." The wind howled, a lonely, bitter sound that swallowed the man's low. Silas stood perfectly still, his silhouette massive against the snow. He looked out into the darkness of the pass, then turned slowly to look back at Elara standing in the doorway of the forge. Dawn was only 4 hours away, and the war was no longer just coming to the mountain. It was already here. Silas Vance did not execute the 2 bounty hunters in the snow. He was a man capable of tremendous violence, but he was not a butcher. Instead, he dragged them both to the heavy timber post at the edge of the clearing, retrieving a length of thick, cold-forged iron chain from beneath a tarp. He bound them securely to the wood, wrapping the heavy links with the precise, unbreakable logic of a master blacksmith. They would not freeze to death before dawn. Their heavy coats would see to that. But they would not be walking down the mountain either. When he stepped back inside the forge, the brutal cold of the night rushed in with him. He shut the heavy wooden double doors and immediately dropped the massive 6-foot iron bar back into its brackets. The echoing clang felt different this time. It was no longer the sound of a man locking the world out. It was the sound of a man sealing his resolve. Silas walked to the center of the room. He did not immediately relight the stove, wary of the smoke giving away their exact status to anyone watching from the lower rid. Instead, he struck a single match and lit the oil lantern on his workbench, keeping the flame extremely low. The amber light flickered across the stone walls, catching the glint of anvils, hammers, and the quiet, exhausted face of the woman standing by the chair. Elara had not moved. She stood with her back straight, the heavy wool blanket clutched tightly around the torn shoulder of her gray dress. Her repaired boots were planted firmly on the floorboards. She looked at Silas, taking in the blood smeared across the knuckles of his leather gloves, the heavy rise and fall of his chest beneath the canvas coat. 30 men, Elara said quietly. Her voice did not break, but the sheer weight of the number hung in the cold air between them. If Garland Cross brings 30 men up this pass, this iron door won't hold them forever. They will burn the timber roof right over our heads. Silas walked over to his cot and reached beneath the mattress, pulling out a heavy leather saddlebag. I know. You fought for me, she continued, her fingers tightening on the edge of the blanket. You broke a man's ribs for me. You fixed my boots. You gave me the only safe night I've had since my father died. She took a deep, trembling breath. I won't let you die for me, Silas. I can walk out of here. If I surrender the ledger page to them on the trail, they'll leave you alone. Your exile stays intact. Silas stopped packing. He dropped a box of rifle cartridges into the saddlebag and turned to look at her. His deep-set brown eyes caught the lantern light. There was an immense, quiet storm in his gaze, a lifetime of watching the strong devour the weak, of walking away because the law offered no justice. 10 years ago, he had chosen the mountain because he could not stomach the corruption of the valley. But looking at Elara, at the fierce, unbroken dignity of a woman who had been dragged through mud and sold like cattle, yet still offered to sacrifice her own freedom to protect a stranger, Silas knew his exile was over. The day I let a woman walk into a mob of hired guns to protect my peace, Silas said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that commanded the absolute attention of the room, is the day I stop calling myself a man. He walked slowly toward her, stopping at the respectful distance he always maintained. Garland Cross owns the sheriff in Colder Creek. He owns the county judge, Silas stated, his tone shifting into the cold, practical rhythm of a frontier tactician. But his money doesn't stretch past the territorial line. The federal marshal out of Fort Bridger owes Cross nothing. He's been looking for a reason to audit the valley's land deeds for 5 years. Elara's eyes widened. Her hand instinctively pressed against her bodice, feeling the crisp fold of the ledger page. The original numbers, the forged signatures. This page is the proof the marshal needs to open a federal investigation. It's the key that hangs him, Silas confirmed. Cross knows it. That's why he isn't waiting for the circuit judge. He needs that paper burned before it leaves the county. Fort Bridger is a 3-day ride, Elara said, the reality of the geography sinking in. Through the high passes, and Garland's men will be coming up the main trail by sunrise. Then we don't take the main trail, Silas said. He turned back to his workbench and opened a wooden chest. There's a logging track on the north face of the ridge. It's steep and it's dangerous in the snow. Cross's men won't know it's there. We can be 5 miles into the deep timber before they even reach my front door." Elara heard the word, we. He wasn't just pointing her in the right direction. He wasn't just giving her a horse. He was coming with her. The man who had isolated himself from humanity for a decade was strapping on his rifle to ride into a federal war for a seamstress he had met less than 6 hours ago. Silas pulled something from the wooden chest and walked back to her. He held out a thick, dark green flannel shirt, worn soft at the elbows but heavy and incredibly warm. "Your dress is torn," Silas said softly. He didn't look at the exposed, bruised skin of her shoulder. He kept his gaze fixed respectfully on her eyes. "The blanket won't stay on when you ride. Put this on. It'll keep the wind out." Elara looked at the shirt, then up at his weathered face. She slowly let the wool blanket slide from her shoulders. It pooled at her feet on the floorboards. She reached out and took the flannel shirt from his hands. As she pulled it on, the fabric carrying the faint, comforting scent of wood smoke and pine, she felt something tight and guarded in her chest finally begin to unravel. She buttoned the shirt, her trembling fingers finding the rhythm. When she finished, she looked up. Silas had turned his back, giving her the privacy she hadn't even had to ask for. "Silas," she said. He looked over his shoulder. "When we get to Fort Bridger," Elara said, her voice steady and clear, "when I hand this ledger to the marshal and Garland Cross is arrested, what happens then?" Silas looked around the forge. He looked at the heavy anvil, the cooling iron stove, the stone walls he had built with his own hands. "Then the law does its job," Silas said. "And the land Garland stole goes back to the people he took it from, including your father's." He paused, his dark eyes returning to her face. "You'll have your home back. You can go back to being Elara Hayes. You will belong to no one but yourself." Elara held his gaze. "And you?" she asked softly. "Will you come back to the mountain?" The silence stretched between them, thick and pregnant with the weight of the unspoken. Silas looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the fierce intelligence in her hazel eyes, the resilience in her small frame, and the profound, unquestioning trust she had placed in him. "A forge is just iron and stone," Silas said quietly, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "It only means something if there's a reason to keep the fire lit."